Hey lady, welcome to the Grit, Growth, Grace podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Anne Marie. I'm wife to James and mom to 4 beautiful kids, plus 1 miscarried baby, from 9 months up to 8 years. My hope is to help other women experience the postpartum period, all the way up to the first year of baby's life, as a time of grit, growth, and grace. This is episode 3, a tale of 4 postpartum stories, part 2. So when we finished episode 2, part 1, we were just about to my third labor and birth. So my first labor lasted right around 24 hours, and my second labor was induced and took about the same amount of time. But my third labor with my second son lasted just under 10 hours from start to finish. I had laughing gas, which is, technically it's called nitrous oxide, but it's better known as laughing gas only. And it didn't take away the pain, but it did take away the anxiety, the feeling of wanting to crawl out of my own skin during each contraction. And because the half-life, how long it lasts in your body for nitrous oxide or laughing gas, is less than a minute, I was 100% aware and with it for my son's birth and every moment after. Of course, every time you give birth, it's a rush, right? But this was on a whole nother level. While I'd been groggy for my second birth because I'd just received pain medicine right before I started pushing, this time I was engaged and present. Wow. My physical recovery was slow, and that was on purpose. I walked, I went to pelvic floor physical therapy at 6 weeks to get assessed and start strengthening exercises, and I looked up postpartum specific workouts on YouTube. I embraced the idea of postpartum as its own specific time, not just the gross, messy leftovers after pregnancy and labor and birth. I didn't make supper for a month. That's right, a month after he was born. We had meals made for us. My mom filled our fridge and freezer right after my son was born. My mother-in-law came to stay with us for a little while. We used gift cards, and then my husband made meals. And even though Christmas came just 3 weeks after my son was born, I wasn't hustling. Those first few months postpartum were really wonderful. And yet I still feared postpartum depression magically sneaking up on me, in part because I found that counseling hadn't been the cure-all I'd hoped for. I still often found myself in worry spirals, and I felt afraid because I thought counseling was it. I'd bet the farm, so to speak, but I still often felt anxious. I thought I had no options left. If counseling hadn't been enough, I thought, this is it. If you're thinking I was still stuck in a victim mentality, ding, 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 you're right. I think it's worth pausing for a second in this place, though. I know I'm not alone in fearing what another child would do to my mental health. I read not long ago that the average woman has 1.64 children in her lifetime, and that number is in contrast to the 2.7 children women say they actually hoped for. Of course, no, you can't have 0.7 or 0.64 children, but these are averages, and here's what these numbers tell us. Women are having fewer children than they even hoped for. Why is that? Well, certainly many factors are at play. One factor, though, is that sometimes postpartum is such a rough time that a woman actually limits her family size because of it. And this doesn't just affect women with few financial or material resources. It also affects religious women who hoped for large families. Some of them do continue to have more children, but their mental or emotional health is compromised in the process. But what would it look like if one didn't come at the expense of the other? We know that the glory of God is man or woman fully alive, as early church father Irenaeus said. What would it look like for both children and their moms to thrive? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to my third postpartum story. When my son was about 10 months old, we conceived again, not exactly on purpose. Of course, we know where babies come from, but I was using a mucus-only fertility awareness method, which just means that the only daily observations I made to determine whether I was fertile or not were of mucus, and my mucus observations had become confusing to me. Combine that with us using the third day after presumed ovulation, aka P plus 3 for intercourse, instead of waiting to the 4th day per the Creighton method protocol, and my youngest son was on the way. We were excited, of course, and I also felt very fearful. I maintained this idea, maybe this will be a little familiar to you too, that postpartum in particular was such a stressful time, with every little thing bringing me one step closer to the edge, to the brink, one step closer to breaking. I feared being stretched to my breaking point, Like I was just one fill-in-the-blank problem away from the straw that broke the camel's back. Like every little thing was depleting me, wearing me down. How much could I handle? And I felt ashamed because I believed I wouldn't be able to handle much. But God never abandons his people, as they say in the Bible. As I look back on these past 8 years since my first pregnancy, I see how very gentle he was with me, how he never left me, and how he carried me along so gradually. Counseling helped me see where my coping mechanisms had come from, and it helped me correct many of the behaviors and ways of relating to others that hadn't served me. But I hadn't yet taken ownership of my own thoughts, hadn't yet wrestled with the Bible verse from 2 Corinthians 10:5 that says, "Take every thought captive in obedience to Christ." Enter Metanoia Catholic coaching, plus spiritual direction, plus an anxiety course. In future episodes, we'll dive into some of the gems from Metanoia Catholic, spiritual direction, and the anxiety course. But here I'll sum up one thing I learned from both Metanoia Catholic and the course that made a big difference throughout my pregnancy and this postpartum period. Through both Metanoia Catholic and the anxiety course, I learned that I am not my thoughts. Girl, please, what? Here's what I mean. When I'm pregnant and then postpartum, every crazy story I've ever read or heard of some pregnant or postpartum woman doing something horrific to her child or children comes to my mind. I've historically judged myself hard for having these thoughts, and this has been an easy peasy predictable way for the devil to introduce self-doubt into my heart. What kind of a mom thinks about these things? Am I in danger of doing something terrible? Can I trust myself? How can I prove to myself that I can trust myself? That is a rabbit hole with no bottom. But here's the reality. Just because something occurs to me, for example, something terrible that I could do to one of my children, that has exactly zero to do with my core. I am not my thoughts. I am not responsible for what random thing pops into my head. I mentioned in episode 2 the concept I learned from Dr. Greg Bottaro in the Catholic Mindfulness course. The mind has thoughts the way the heart has beats. I don't control what comes in, though tangentially, there's some indirect influence based on what music I listen to, what I read, what movies I watch, etc. But I can't force myself to only think about certain things or never to think of other things. What is in my sphere of influence, my responsibility, is how I respond to my thoughts. Whether or not I dwell on or ruminate upon scary or weird thoughts, how seriously I take them, that's up to me. The more ownership I've taken over my thought life, the more peace of heart I've experienced. Most of the time, rather than analyzing every random thought, it looks like not taking them seriously, releasing them rather than holding on to them and analyzing them, being gentle with myself and curious towards my thoughts rather than being judgmental or agreeing with them. And slowly that's looked like loosening my grasp on my fear that postpartum, or the stresses of life in general, is going to crush me. I'm fascinated by the idea of putting in the reps, especially during postpartum. In his best-selling book, Atomic Habits, author James Clear says that every action is casting a vote for the kind of person you wish to become. Rather than saying that any day now the stress is going to get to me, what if I asked, what is the lesson I can learn from this? What if I looked at the challenges like a weightlifter in the gym? What if each rep is bringing me closer to the kind of person I want to become? These concepts aren't just theoretical to me, especially not with my most recent labor and birth experience. Immediately after he was born, I told people that my son, my youngest, who's now 10 months, came in a blaze of glory. But that's only partly true. The day he was born, I went to my regularly scheduled 39-week OB appointment. It was 2 days until my due date, so I figured I had a few days to go. But I'd had bloody show that morning and was starting to have irregular contractions on the way to the appointment. The OB filling in for my OB, who was out of the country, checked me for the first time, and I was dilated to a 6. She told me to go to the hospital, and after stopping for Dairy Queen on the way, I went. But once there, my experience wasn't awesome. The medical staff wanted to break my water and intervene in other ways, while I wanted my body's natural labor process to be respected. Unfortunately, the doctor on call was uninterested in respecting my body's timeline, and once I refused to have my water broken, she essentially threw up her hands and stepped away. My nurse was kind, but unfortunately not trained in unmedicated birth. Suffice to say, 6 hours after I arrived at the hospital, no one recognized when I was in transition or getting close to pushing, and my son was born with just my husband and the nurse in the room. He was very nearly born on the floor in the middle of the hospital room, and the only reason he didn't fall out onto the floor was because my husband picked me up and put me on the bed just in time. While I'd labored like a champ, my son's birth was treated like an emergency because the hospital staff weren't expecting him yet, despite my clearly expressed wishes in my birth plan and the reality that a baby being born on a labor and delivery unit shouldn't be breaking news. 8 different people swarmed into the room, none of whom were familiar with my labor. His umbilical cord was clamped immediately. He was whisked away to a warmer instead of being put on my chest for skin to skin, even though he'd cried immediately after being born. And a resident was up to her elbow inside of me, tugging on the placenta without even asking my permission before I even knew what was happening. After the high of, "He's here already!" wore off, other harder emotions set in. Frustration, disappointment, anger at the on-call OB and the resident, and even at the nurse who didn't know how to care for me properly, all surged through me. I learned from that birth that it's not enough simply to prepare well, which I had done. Even when you do your best, and you do well, things don't always go according to plan. Now, could you look at my situation and say, "For goodness sake, girl, at least you have a healthy baby"? Yes, you could. And gratitude is always a good choice. At the same time, it's also good to say, what needed to be done differently? What actions can I take to help things be different for other women after me? For me, part of that looked like talking to upper management at both the hospital and the OB practice and negotiating to get $1,000 taken off my bill because I didn't receive appropriate, respectful, evidence-based medical care. But as far as my thoughts go, this postpartum I've been learning the skill of relinquishing control, the skill of acceptance, the skill of letting go of my expectations and my plans, the skill of releasing anger, and mercy. These are tough skills to learn. I am far from perfect. Some days I'm far from even being competent, but I'm learning. Through all of this, all of it, it's easier than ever before for me to believe that postpartum can be a truly transformative time. It's a time we need to intentionally prepare for, and a time worth embracing in its own right as its own specific season. And there are lessons and an abundance of grace waiting for us there, in between and inside of the marvelous warm moments, as well as the hard, pointy, pokey ones. As you've heard, I'm very much on the journey, lady. God willing, there will be other postpartums in my future, and I look forward to what's in store in each one. I'd be honored to journey with you too. Together, let's do postpartum on purpose. In episode 4, we're talking about what to do when you, for whatever reason, don't have family around to help. I'll talk to you then.